A 2021 UNICEF report states that more than 65% of young South Africans have suffered some form of mental health issue for which they've received no assistance. One symptom of these challenges is performing self-harming acts. Self-harm is the act of deliberately inflicting pain to one's body through cutting, burning, or other methods. South African Society of Psychiatrists says that self-harm is a serious problem, often dismissed as attention-seeking behavior. The age of onset is 12 years, or the start of puberty. A quarter of those surveyed did not find their mental health problems serious, and 20% did not know where to seek help. Well, for a little bit more on this, we're now joined via Zoom by Dr. Merrin Young, who's a member of the South African Society of Psychiatrists. Dr. Young, thanks so much for joining us. 65% is a staggering figure. Given the profession that you're in, does this figure surprise you, or is this what you've been seeing in your practice?
Hi, Peter. Thank you so much for having me this evening. No, it doesn't surprise me. I think for most people who don't often work with adolescents or with people struggling with mental health, it would seem like a massive number, sort of 2 out of every 3. But it is really what we're seeing. I mean, obviously not all 65% of those adolescents are going to be severely ill enough to be self-harming. It's probably only about 10-20%, but really we're seeing huge numbers. And so I think it's really important that we talk about something like this.
I would imagine from the outset that there's quite a broad spectrum of mental health. And I just wonder if you could take us from the very mild to the extreme. What are we seeing? What are the things that come into your profession?
So mental health is going to cover a whole range of things. So everything from sort of anxiety, just kind of general stress levels, to mood, to physical things like eating or sleep difficulties, concentration, so ADHD, learning difficulties, all fall within the remit of psychiatry. But within that, there's definitely always going to be a spectrum. So, there's general stress and anxiety, which actually helps us because it makes us prepare for tests and prepare for sports matches. But when it starts leading to really high levels of distress or impacting on our functioning, then I think that's where we are looking at more disorders. And certainly when we're talking about self-harm, which is an extreme kind of expression of distress or suicidal thoughts, then we're reaching the really high end of the spectrum where we've got to have more serious interventions.
Is there anything peculiar about South Africa that makes our young people perhaps particularly vulnerable? You know, we talk about periods in history, so perhaps during apartheid, there were different realities that were playing on our mental health challenges. What about now? What is it that they're facing that's causing all of this mental anguish?
So absolutely. So I do think that actually the numbers and the representation that we see in South Africa is very similar to what we see worldwide in various different higher, middle, low income countries. So mental health challenges are certainly a global phenomenon. But here in South Africa, I think there has been a legacy where there's been particular areas of adversity and if we think about families where there's been separations, where people have had to work away from home, where there's been inequality, certainly we see high numbers where there's been social adversity, which we know in our country is certainly something that we faced. But also more recently, I think just generally, there have been high pressures. So if we think about the impact that COVID's had, this UNICEF study that you cited in the beginning has been a post-COVID study that was done in 2021. So there's those pressures, the difficulties that children and adolescents have faced through that, social distancing from their friends, academic difficulties, the pressures of needing to get into the workspace, into universities, plus also what technology is adding into the mix. There's all of those pressures, what our children are being fed on their feeds. It's not curated and necessarily as vetted by their families anymore. They have access to things. There's a lot more online bullying, which I don't think was there in previous years. And so I think all of those things taken together are certainly pointing towards us needing to put things in place, because we're really going to see high levels of distress and mental health difficulties in this particular age group.
I suppose the problem of not diagnosing mental health issues is that when you break your arm, you can see it's broken, it's painful. But when it comes to mental health, it's hard to see it as an injury. And I just wonder, is this part of the reason why it's not diagnosed, that people don't go and get help? And they just think maybe they're down, not realizing actually this is a real mental health issue.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it's important to acknowledge that it is every bit as real as a broken arm or malaria or meningitis. There's a lot of biological vulnerabilities that lead towards mental health difficulties. So we know they're very real illnesses. But I think where we need to be recognizing is where we see functional impairment. So when the stress or the mood difficulties go beyond just having a bad day and start impacting on functioning. So particularly when we're talking within the adolescent population, I think parents should be looking out for things like big changes in sleep patterns, in eating, in withdrawals. So not being able to manage at school, with declines in academics, with not wanting to do extramurals or being with their friends, things that would be general functionings of an adolescent. So when the difficulties start impacting on that, or when they start presenting with high levels of distress like self-harm, then I think it's pretty clear that there is more than just a bad day that's happening, that's where we need to acknowledge that this is the psychiatric broken arm that needs higher levels of intervention.
Is there a disparity or a skew in terms of young women and young men? Because as a young man, we were taught you got to step up, toughen up and suck it. Do you know what I mean? And I just wonder if you see more problems with young men than young women, or is it equally dispersed?
So I think it's actually pretty equally dispersed. I think it just sometimes presents in different ways. So when we're thinking about the self-harm that we started talking about this evening, girls will see more with, say, cutting. So where they're cutting their arms or their inner thighs, whereas boys will probably more likely to be using things like burning or hitting themselves. And so sometimes the way that they present differs, and maybe that is because of how they've been raised or what they've been modeled in their home. We know that what we model to our children is really important, and how they see the world and make representations of that for themselves. But I do think that there's probably equal numbers of distress across girls and boys.
All right, so where should parents take their children as a first step, a first line? If they think that, things are not adding up here, there's something wrong and my child needs help. And I guess there's probably going to be resistance from those young people.
There can be. I think sometimes they're just so grateful that their cries for help have been observed and heard. Sometimes there's a reluctance to maybe admit that to a parent. Often children don't want to burden their parents. They don't want to let their parents worry about them. And so they do keep it quite hidden. But I think once it's been recognized, the important thing for parents to remember is that there needs to be a team approach. I think as a parent, it's incredibly frightening to think that your child might not be doing okay and that they're hurting themselves or really distressed. And so I think the first port of call would be to go to someone trusted, like a GP, and sometimes just going to a GP or going to a counselor. Certainly, if something like self-harm hasn't become an entrenched pattern, is going to be all that's necessary. Sometimes there'll need to be a referral to a more specialized service. But I think certainly parents need to call on someone outside so that they can keep that parental role and let somebody else do more of the assistance and helping with coping strategies. Also important for families and for adolescents actually to remember that there are other organizations. So something like SADAG, the South African Depression and Anxiety Group, SADAG, they have lots of helplines that teenagers and parents can call, literally 24/7 helplines. And so phoning up somewhere there, going to the GP, going to the local clinic would be a great place to start.
All right, a question I should have asked you earlier actually is, why self-harm? What does that do?
So I think it's quite counterintuitive. So it's a question I get asked all the time. Why on earth are they doing that? And people sometimes think that it's a manipulation technique, and it's not at all. It really is. So if you do a questionnaire amongst people who do self-harm, the number one reason is that it alleviates this intense emotional distress, these intense negative emotions. It's almost like discharging static electricity. They self-harm and those negative feelings reduce and they feel some kind of help and relief, even if it's just temporary. Also, sometimes it's a part of self-punishment, and sometimes as well, it's a way of making that internal pain become real. So sometimes teenagers will say, you know, when I hurt myself, I can see the hurt, and then it makes the hurt real, and then it's easier for them to deal with. It's almost as though it's externalizing that emotional pain on the inside. So I think the important thing to remember is that hurting themselves, even if it doesn't seem logical to us, is serving a purpose, and it's usually to alleviate their distress.
All right, Dr. Young, I wish we could talk for a bit longer, but we've run out of time. Thank you so much for joining us on the program this evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, that's Dr. Merin Young, who's a member of the South African Society of Psychiatrists. And I think the message there is, as parents, as caregivers, we really need to pay attention to our young people, because they probably are going through something. 65% of young South Africans, as been found by this report, suffer some mental health challenges that sadly don't get dealt with.